For 7 straight years, the winner of the Tour de France was the same man. Every summer, the result felt historic. And every summer, it felt harder to explain. The Tour de France is not just another race. It is widely considered the most demanding endurance competition in professional sport. 3 weeks of racing, thousands of kilometers, mountain stages, time trials, and relentless physical stress. Winning once can define a career. Winning 7 times in a row challenged the limits of belief. Fans were offered a simple explanation. He passed every test. That man was Lance Armstrong. And for a long time, questioning him felt almost unreasonable. Professional cycling was experiencing a resurgence. The Tour de France had become a global television spectacle. Millions followed each stage live across Europe, North America, and beyond. Teams were backed by multinational sponsors. Equipment manufacturers invested heavily in technology. Broadcast rights grew more valuable every year. Cycling was no longer just a sport. It was a global business. Winning did not only mean prestige, it meant endorsements, influence, and long-term financial security. Armstrong embodied everything the sport wanted to project. A cancer survivor who returned to competition. An athlete framed as proof that discipline, science, and resilience could overcome human limits. According to official records, he never failed a drug test. Not once. But professional cycling carried a long and uncomfortable history. Long before Armstrong's rise, the sport had already been shaped by repeated doping scandals. Cycling was one of the first professional sports to confront the consequences of performance-enhancing substances. As early as the mid-20th century, stimulants were openly used in long-distance races. Riders relied on amphetamines to stay alert and push through exhaustion during multi-day competitions. By the 1960s and 1970s, the risks became impossible to ignore. Several high-profile incidents forced cycling authorities to acknowledge that performance enhancement had become systemic. Some riders collapsed during races. Others suffered long-term health consequences. In response, governing bodies introduced early drug controls, but enforcement was inconsistent and detection methods were limited. By the 1980s, blood manipulation techniques began to appear. Athletes experimented with transfusions to increase oxygen capacity even before the practice was fully understood. The sport entered a familiar pattern. Each generation brought stronger riders. Each generation also brought more sophisticated ways to push the limits. Scandals emerged. Reforms followed. Then, new substances replaced old ones. By the time the 90s arrived, professional cycling carried a reputation it could not fully escape. Fans knew the sport had a problem. Officials knew it even more clearly. What changed was not the existence of doping, but the scale, organization, and scientific precision behind it. This history mattered, because Armstrong did not rise in a vacuum. He rose in a sport already conditioned to look the other way, as long as performances remained believable and the spectacle continued. By the 1990s, cycling was changing rapidly. Training became more scientific. Nutrition plans became precise. Equipment became lighter, faster, and more aerodynamic. Medical knowledge advanced at the same time. One substance transformed endurance sports almost overnight. Erythropoietin, commonly known as EPO. EPO increases red blood cell production. More red blood cells mean more oxygen delivered to muscles. More oxygen means greater endurance and faster recovery. For endurance athletes, the advantage was enormous. The problem was detection. In its early years, EPO was extremely difficult to identify through testing. Anti-doping agencies lacked reliable methods. Athletes and doctors understood this gap. As testing lagged behind practice, behavior adapted. By the late 90s, cycling performances accelerated dramatically. Climbing speeds increased. Recovery time shortened. Recovers that had stood for decades fell in quick succession. Inside the peloton, riders noticed. Outside the sport, fans were reassured. Officials insisted testing was rigorous. Controls were frequent. The system worked. For most viewers, that reassurance was enough. If the tests were clean, then the sport must be clean. But within teams, a different reality existed. Inside professional cycling teams, doping was rarely framed as a reckless gamble. According to later testimony, it was treated as part of preparation. Teams were hierarchical organizations. Riders answered to directors. Directors coordinated with doctors. Doctors controlled access to medical protocols. New riders did not receive instructions immediately. They learned gradually. Performance expectations were made clear. So were the consequences of falling behind. Medical programs were introduced as support. Recovery assistance, optimization, monitoring. Substances were discussed in controlled language, rarely by name, often by routine. Blood transfusions were scheduled during rest periods. Doses were calculated carefully. Procedures were supervised to minimize risk. Timing mattered. Testing windows were anticipated based on race calendars. Substances were used when detection was least likely. Microdosing reduced exposure while preserving benefits. Compliance was rarely enforced through threats. It was enforced socially. Riders who followed the program kept their place on the team. They received support. They competed for wins. Riders who resisted faced isolation. Fewer opportunities, shorter contracts. Doping did not feel like cheating inside the system. It felt like survival. Lance Armstrong rose to dominance within this environment. He won his first Tour de France in 1990, then again in 2000, and again in 2001. Each victory reinforced the narrative. He was different, more disciplined, more professional, more prepared. When questions surfaced, he denied everything, publicly, aggressively. Critics were framed as jealous rivals. Journalists were accused of chasing sensationalism. Former teammates were dismissed as unreliable. Legal pressure played a role. Speaking out carried risk. And because drug tests continued to come back negative, the denials held. For years, what most people did not see was how limited those tests actually were. At the time, anti-doping testing relied on a narrow set of tools. Most tests searched for the presence of banned substances in urine samples. They worked best when substances were taken in large amounts or close to competition. Endurance doping had already moved past that phase. Substances like EPO mimicked hormones the body naturally produced. Once processed, they left little direct evidence behind. Tests were searching for traces that often no longer existed. Instead of large doses, athletes used microdosing, small amounts taken frequently, enough to improve performance, but not enough to trigger a positive result. Timing became critical. Substances were administered well before testing windows. Blood values normalized before samples were collected. Blood transfusions posed an even greater challenge. Using an athlete's own blood was virtually undetectable at the time. Anti-doping agencies were also constrained by procedure. Testing schedules were often predictable. Surprise controls were limited. A single abnormal value was rarely enough. False positives carried serious consequences. Athletes could sue, careers could be destroyed unfairly. Institutions faced financial and reputational risk. This created caution, sometimes hesitation, sometimes delay. By the time stronger detection methods were introduced, many years of competition had already passed. Governing bodies faced another problem. Professional cycling was governed by multiple organizations. Race organizers, international federations, national bodies, anti-doping agencies. Each had different incentives. Race organizers depended on spectacle, broadcasters depended on stars, sponsors depended on positive narratives. The Tour de France was an economic engine. Entire cities relied on it. Tourism surged. Media rights generated enormous revenue. Exposing a systemic problem threatened stability. This created a conflict. On one hand, officials publicly supported clean sport. On the other, confronting widespread wrongdoing risked collapsing the system they managed. Anti-doping agencies needed evidence strong enough to survive appeals. They faced lawsuits from athletes previously cleared. Mistakes were costly. Warnings were treated as isolated incidents. Patterns were explained individually rather than systemically. Success brought money. Money brought stability. Stability discouraged disruption. The situation changed when investigators shifted focus away from tests alone. For years, investigations stalled because they relied almost entirely on laboratory evidence. USADA approached the problem differently. Instead of asking whether a single test proved guilt, they asked whether patterns explained the evidence better than coincidence. Their investigation prioritized corroboration, multiple independent witnesses, consistent timelines, matching descriptions of procedures. Former riders spoke under oath. Team staff described the same routines. Accounts aligned in detail. No single witness carried the case. Overlapping testimony built credibility. USADA operated under a different legal framework. Its mandate focused on enforcement rather than promotion. It did not depend on the same commercial relationships within cycling. The agency used non-analytical evidence, testimony, documents, circumstantial patterns. The probability of coincidence was deemed effectively zero. In 2012, the ruling became official. Lance Armstrong was stripped of all 7 Tour de France titles. He received a lifetime ban from professional cycling. The fallout was immediate. Sponsors ended partnerships, teams erased association. The Tour de France removed his name entirely. But the consequences extended far beyond one athlete. An entire generation of riders came under suspicion. Podiums were reassessed. Results were questioned. Some races were left without official winners. Athletes who had never failed a test found their achievements reinterpreted. Careers were not always ended, but reputations were altered. Teams were restructured, sponsors hesitated. Young riders faced unprecedented scrutiny. For athletes entering the sport afterward, success came with suspicion. Dominance triggered questions. Clean riders were asked to prove innocence repeatedly. The burden shifted. Instead of institutions guaranteeing integrity, individual athletes were expected to demonstrate it constantly. Cycling authorities responded quickly. Testing became more frequent. Out-of-competition controls expanded. Location reporting became mandatory. The biological passport was introduced. Instead of searching for substances, it tracked biological markers over time. Blood values, hormone levels, physiological patterns. Sudden fluctuations became evidence. In many cases, it worked. But no system was perfect. Methods evolved. Marginal gains replaced dramatic enhancements. Authorities walked a narrow line. Act too aggressively and risk punishing clean athletes unfairly. Act too cautiously and risk repeating past failures. For fans, the result was uncertainty. Dominant performances no longer inspired uncomplicated admiration. They invited analysis. Commentary became careful. Praise became qualified. Professional cycling survived the scandal, but trust did not return easily. And doubt, once introduced, has a way of staying.